Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Now, for students of national security, American foreign policy, and grand strategy, today's conversation on U.S.-Pakistan relations will offer a deep dive into one of the most complicated bilateral relationships for the United States. The views on why the United States and Pakistan face challenges are far and wide. However, much of the current state of affairs can be attributed to the security issues that resulted from the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent US-led war effort in Afghanistan. The conversation today will explore how the US-Pakistan relationship has been shaped by the war in Afghanistan and how American policymakers will engage Pakistan towards a political settlement or an end to the military campaign. We are honored to host a group of experienced practitioners who advise presidents, secretaries of state, and foreign leaders on how to navigate the choppy waters of what many of us came to call AFPAC. Our first guest today is Ambassador Doug Lute, who is currently Robert F. McDermott Distinguished Chair of Social Sciences at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He's also a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Kennedy School of Government. During the Obama administration, he served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Council, NATO's standing political body. Previously, Ambassador Lute also served at the White House under Presidents Bush and Obama, first as the Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, and more recently as the Deputy Assistant to the President, focusing on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. He retired from the U.S. military as a Lieutenant General after 35 years of active duty. During this time, he served multiple tours in NATO commands, including a duty in Germany during the Cold War, commanding U.S. forces in Kosovo, and later overseeing U.S. military operations worldwide as Director of Operations on the Joint Chiefs. Ambassador Lute holds degrees from the United States Military Academy and Harvard University, and he has been instrumental in shaping U.S. policy towards South Asia and Afghanistan and Pakistan over the past decade. Our second distinguished guest today is Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who served as the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy to Afghanistan and later as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq. And then he returned to the United States and was appointed U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Ambassador Khalilzad sits on the boards of many renowned institutions, including the National Endowment for Democracy, America Abroad Media, and the RAND Corporation's Middle East Studies Center. He's also a counselor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ambassador Khalilzad holds degrees from the American University of Beirut and earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. The conversation between our two distinguished guests will be moderated by Shamila Chaudhary, who is at Johns Hopkins SAIS in her capacity as a senior advisor to the dean and also a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. She was responsible for Afghanistan and Pakistan policy on the policy planning staff of the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and served on the White House National Security Council from 2010 to 2011 during one of the most challenging periods for U.S.-Pakistan relations. And I might add, also served under General Lute at that time. Engaging practitioners who have been intimately involved in shaping foreign policy and solving complex challenges is not an important part of our programming at Johns Hopkins, is not just an important part of our programming at Johns Hopkins SAIS. It is an extension of our academic curriculum and mandate to create a prestigious cadre of global leaders who can solve any problem anywhere in the world. It also serves our mission of thought leadership to guide policy making on critical issues around the world. So in this spirit, I hope you will enjoy today's discussion, and I challenge you to think critically and openly about policies and problems that may seem insurmountable. That's not to say necessarily that the US-Pakistan relations is one such problem, but we may think of it in those terms. Thank you. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for joining us today. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming them to the podium. Thank you.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Bobby. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And let me just say it's a privilege and an honor to be able to grill your former boss in front of a public audience.
You grilled me pretty well when we were in office together.
So we'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And when you ask your question, please make sure it's a question and introduce yourself and your affiliation. So before we start, I wanted to give just a little bit of the backdrop for today's conversation. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was just in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and following his meetings with the Pakistani government, he said that they went well, but the U.S. would still like Pakistan to eradicate militants that are based on its soil, and that Pakistan should play a constructive role in the peace and reconciliation process in Afghanistan. And the Pakistani foreign minister said that the meeting was cordial, but he also noted that Pakistan was seeking a transparent relationship with the United States, and one that was based on equal terms with the U.S., and one that does not view Pakistan as its proxy to fight its wars. So there's a great deal of nuance in this statement coming from the foreign minister. It's short and terse, but I think if you unpack it, you'll find a lot of the complexities that come along with the US-Pakistan relationship, and a great deal of it also involves Afghanistan. And so I wanted to start our conversation with this, that proxies are typically actors or governments or organizations that you use to advance a certain goal, and you have to have a common or shared interest with that proxy in order for that strategy to actually work. And at the moment, I think the foreign minister is actually right, that the US and Pakistan are not able to fulfill the terms of that proxy relationship. But when we talk about proxies, we're talking about priorities, and there's a lot of competing priorities that are at play here. And so this is what I wanted to start off with Ambassador Lute. You have been someone that has advocated for a modest approach to dealing with Pakistan and engaging on some of the policy conflicts between the US and Pakistan. And you've noted, and in my time working for you, you would often say this, that there are urgent short-term goals that the United States must pursue with Pakistan. And those deal with security and counterterrorism and al-Qaeda, but there are a lot of long-term priorities in that relationship, and we can't disadvantage the long term by pushing too hard on the short term. So if you could elaborate a little bit on how one balances those competing priorities in a position that you had in advising the President of the United States and the National Security Advisor. How do you advise the leader of the government to not just think about nuclear weapons, but also to think about al-Qaeda and attacks on American citizens?
Well, so if I were asked to characterize the approach that I'd recommend towards Pakistan, I wouldn't necessarily say modest. I would replace that with realistic and focused. And focused on what? I think focused on security, our own national security interests. I mean, that's what makes the world go round, right? It's a sort of self-interested security, stone-cold, sober view of your own interests. And in this region, we don't have close alignment between the interests of the United States and the interests of Pakistan. And that's why we struggle all the time. So the first place we should begin here, and the first place we tried to begin when Shamila and I worked together, is to identify U.S. interests. what are the real hard U.S. interests in this region? I think, and this is not just Pakistan, but the region sort of left and right, north and south of Pakistan, right? Transnational terrorists, which obviously emanated from that region some time ago, 15, 20 years ago, brought us 9/11 from that region, at least in part from that region, but which persists to this day. So you have the remnants of Al-Qaeda there. You have a branch of the so-called Islamic State, the Islamic State of the Khorasan. Am I pronouncing that right? Khorasan. This is why Zal's here, to make sure I'm straight on the details. But you have these extremist groups that still live in this area that do have transnational reach. Now that's important because we're going to come back to some groups who live in the region who don't have transnational reach. And it's important to distinguish those. I don't put the Taliban, for example, in this group of transnational terrorists. Then you have the fact that in this same region, you have nuclear weapons. So you have, I think, in Pakistan, the combination of one of the countries in the world, perhaps the country in the world most challenged by internal extremists with transnational reach, which also has nuclear weapons. And not only does Pakistan have nuclear weapons, but it is the most rapidly enlarging arsenal of nuclear weapons. And they're moving from large scale, what they would refer to as strategic nuclear weapons, to battlefield nuclear weapons, which means minorization, which means certain things in terms of weapon design, and certainly proliferation in terms of numbers. So you have this very dangerous connection from the U.S. national interest perspective of terrorists or extremists with transnational reach and the presence of nuclear weapons. So a good place to start in terms of how to approach Pakistan is to identify those, what I think are very clear national interests. And then step two, and then I'll yield the floor, is to try to reverse roles. Try to step out of our shoes and ask the same question of Pakistan. And I think this is actually true no matter where we work around the world, right? And this is why things like the ability to speak native languages, past experiences, continuity in policy positions, over and over again, going back and treating the same sort of region is so important. We have to develop an effort. We have to develop the ability to look at this from the other side of the equation. And frankly, I don't think we've done that very well with Pakistan. Well, I think we've been quite demanding of Pakistan. I think we've been reasonably clear-cut on what we want, but we haven't always been as attentive to their perspective. And what that means is that we very much enter into this relationship that looks a lot like superior and subordinate, or proxies, and so forth. And you can imagine that doesn't play very well. Now, I'm not saying, and then I will actually yield the floor, Zal. I'm not saying you have to abide by their perspective. But there is absolutely an obligation at the senior policy level to try to understand it. So identify your own interests, try to understand the other side of the equation, and those are the places I would start.
And Ambassador Khalilzad, after the Trump administration announced their strategy for South Asia, you had said that you advocate for a tougher approach towards Pakistan, which the strategy seems to suggest, but does not outline in detail. And so I would like your perspective on the strategy as it exists, and in what way do you see it being tougher on Pakistan? What specific ways?
Sure. Well, first, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Shamal. Thank you, Dean Nasser, and thank you all of you for being here, and thank you to Doug, he's a good friend. We've been at this for a long time together. I've been advocating for a long time a tougher policy on Pakistan. In fact, when I was ambassador in Afghanistan, I warned both publicly and cables that I sent, that some of them are out, that the problem of sanctuaries developing in Pakistan was going to be a big headache, and that we needed to deal with it sooner than later. And it's going to take a long time to go through the history of what happened, what didn't happen. But I believe that Pakistan is not a U.S. proxy. I don't think it's fair to describe the relationship as one of being our proxy. We have not demanded from them to become our proxy in regard to Afghanistan since the overthrow of the Taliban. We have in fact asked them to be a partner. We have asked them not to be an adversary. We have asked them not to play a double game, to be both friend and adversary at the same time. Not to take our money, our support, our assistance, but at the same time allow groups that plan to kill us, kill our people in Afghanistan, to allow groups that are either terrorists, based on our own listing of those groups, characterizing those groups, such as the Haqqani Network, we say it's a terrorist group. But yet we know that the Haqqani group is in Pakistan. We know that the Haqqani group has very strong relationship going back to the 1980s with the ISI. That this is an asset of the ISI that has been used when Pakistan has wanted to use it. We know that the Taliban have their headquarters in Pakistan. They are in Quetta, the Quetta Shura, the Peshawar Shura. There is yet now a new Shura in Miramshar. And these are all places that are in Pakistan, not anywhere else. We know that they recover, rest, they get trained at times, and they get money supplied to them. What we have asked for is that as friends, as allies, as partners, that they don't do that. Doug alluded to that he doesn't regard the Taliban as an international terrorist organization. If you narrowly think about that, that's correct. But if you think about it broadly, they are partners with international terrorists. The head of the Al-Qaeda in Pakistan has pledged allegiance to the leader of Taliban. They fight together. And not only the Al-Qaeda, but also if you look at some other terrorist groups that we know, the Uzbek Islamic Party is a partner. The Haqqani Network is a partner, which we regard as a terrorist organization. Sometimes we deceive ourselves by making distinctions that are unjustified, but I believe that to succeed in Afghanistan in a reasonable amount of time, Pakistani cooperation, at the minimum, not to provide sanctuary and support, is necessary. And at the maximum, if they became a partner, that would be even more helpful. And I believe that we need to work on a strategy, which I'll come to directly answer a question, to change the Pakistani calculus from being an adversary, essentially, in Afghanistan, although there are elements of cooperation, to becoming cooperation in exchange for respect for Pakistani interests in Afghanistan. My objective is not, I don't think the objective of the United States is to, of this administration, is to have a hostile Afghanistan vis-a-vis Pakistan. No. How do you get Pakistan to change its calculus to be more helpful, to be less hostile, and to not allow a sanctuary that from which attacks against the coalition forces, which has been there under UN Security Council mandate, with a legitimate government of Afghanistan in a cooperative arrangement. And I believe that this is one aspect that to think beyond Afghanistan, which makes Pakistan, in my judgment, an abnormal state, to turn it into a normal state. I think Pakistan is an abnormal state on two grounds. One, that it supports terrorism. There is no question. Anyone who says this is not true, I think is not dealing with facts. Pakistan supports terrorism. It supports a Haqqani network, we know it. It supports a number of other groups and individuals that we know are terrorists. And we know quite well that the relationship between these groups and parts of the Pakistani military establishment, there is actually departments inside ISI that are responsible for supporting these groups. We know that. We know that there are, I mean, I could name them, that there are departments inside the Pakistani intelligence with the responsibility to support these groups. Number one. Number two, it is an abnormal state in terms of its nuclear policy. It is moving towards a nuclear strategy which disseminates small bombs all over the country. Small bombs distributed all across, which is increases the danger, as Doug said, when we think about these two issues. And I believe for Pakistan, our goal besides Afghanistan has to be what do we do to get Pakistan to become a normal state? And in my judgment, defeat or success of the strategy of Pakistan vis-a-vis Afghanistan is a determining factor in what sort of Pakistan emerges. If its policy of expansion, which my view is they want to dominate Afghanistan. That's in my judgment, the goal of Pakistan is to dominate Afghanistan, to have a satrapy in Afghanistan that takes its guidance from Islamabad. And they believe that with a larger kind of geopolitical space, nuclear weapons, they can reestablish the Mughal empire in Central Asia and South Asia. They see themselves as the legitimate successors to the Mughals who ruled South Asia. So therefore, in my view, going to dealing with Pakistan to make it to get it to become a normal state, defined by those, particularly with regard to Afghanistan at that stage, is very important. Now, one sentence about the administration's details. I think the administration, I applaud it for recognizing the problem frontally, not by kind of complex sentences coined in some academia, but in a realistic way.
Not here, sorry.
Yeah, in a realistic way, recognizing the sanctuary issue, and coming with the view that here is what Pakistan needs to do. And they have given great detail, I'm aware of, to Pakistan as to what is expected as a friend, and to give them a period of time to deliberate on it. And if they don't cooperate, first of all, it's very important to know that there is a consensus inside the government about the problem. There is no intelligence community differing from the White House, differing from the Defense Department, differing from the State Department. There is a consensus that this is a problem. And I believe that very strongly. I'm aware of it. Second, that there should be given a time frame and a list of requests. And if not, then the strategy needs to adjust. And the adjustment is, we'll have a chance to talk about it, because there is a menu of options and a timeline and escalation ladder of what steps must be taken or will be taken. And we can discuss that in detail as we go forward. I think the fact that they haven't laid out everything in public doesn't mean that there is no plan. There is, in fact, quite a detailed plan of escalation that one way or the other, this issue has to be dealt with. Either they do it, if not, we will have to find ways to deal with it. The choice is Pakistan's, and I think that's a reasonable position to have.
So, sorry, Shamila.
So I would
let me just come
Doug's
back
reaction
to
this. Yeah.
So I do have a couple of reactions. Number one, I don't sense that Pakistan has this sort of expansionist, even imperial, or sort of the Mughal Empire redux kind of perspective. I actually think my view of internal Pakistani anxieties and concerns, national interest maybe, is to hold the state of Pakistan together. I mean, I think that at the 40-year mark, 70-year mark since the creation of Pakistan, they appreciate what a mix this is and what a difficult challenge it is to hold the ethnic groups in Pakistan together and stabilize Pakistan itself. I think the reason they have not taken dramatic physical steps against the Afghan Taliban is that they have a Pashtun problem. They're not as worried about the Afghan Taliban as they are the Pakistani Taliban. And by the way, I think Shamila one time, you know, as we occasionally play Stump the Action Officer in the National Security Council, I asked the question, how many Pashtuns are there? Oh, people run away. And how many are aware, right? Somebody goes to Wikipedia, they figure there are 40 million Pashtuns. It is perhaps the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have a nation state, right? So it's a nation without a nation state. And then, to Zal's question, where are they? 60% of them are in Pakistan. Only 40% in Afghanistan. So when you begin to get at some of these underlying facts, a lot of things become a little more clear.
So how did that lead you to support the Taliban to destabilize Afghanistan? How does that?
No, I'm not saying, well, first of all, I don't.
I mean, this is a fact of the
I don't believe they're trying to destabilize.
Well,
I don't believe they're trying to destabilize Afghanistan. I think it's in their interest to stabilize Afghanistan and to make sure that the Indian presence in Afghanistan is metered, is calibrated. They don't want India on both flanks. Right. Okay, but my sense is they are more internally absorbed with their own stability, and that's the reason that they don't go after the Afghan Taliban. And by the way, Baluchistan, of course, is another. They've got another uprising on their hands in Baluchistan, right? So my sense is that they're even inside the military organization, right? They're much more concerned about internal stability than they are expansionism.
Well, let me respond to this.
You've asked your question, Shamila. Now Zal.
No.
Zal and I are going to take over.
Did I ask my question?
This is like what when he was in power, I used to go and talk with him.
I don't even need to be here, actually.
Yeah. Let me say, I think Doug is absolutely right about the problems of Pakistan. I think that it's no doubt about that. But the policy does not, in my judgment, reflect those problems. The policy is at odds with those problems. In what way? If Pakistan was concerned about stability in Afghanistan, that it wants stability in Afghanistan, wants this government to succeed, wants to have good relations with Afghanistan, why would it allow sanctuaries and support for groups that are fighting this government? Why would it provide sometimes fire to protect the retreating Taliban into its territory?
Yeah. So here's a
wait, let me finish. But why would it move against its own Taliban and ask us in Afghanistan and ask the Afghan government, which we have, to attack, kill Pakistani Taliban, and we have done it, and arrest them, but then it doesn't move against the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan. It allows supplies to them, it allows support for them, it allows training of them. And then when it moves against its own insurgents in Waziristan, it warns the Haqqani network and put them in air-conditioned buses and sends them away from there. How do you reconcile this weak and divided and uncertain Pakistan, internally focused, and the behavior? And why have departments inside your intelligence agency in charge of supporting them? And then on India, that it doesn't want India on its side. You have a president, President Ghani, all of us know him. Post-inauguration, he freezes relations with India, more or less. He travels first to Pakistan. He sits with the military chief and it goes to his headquarters and says, what do you want from us on India? And I'm here to open a new chapter in relations. It's only, in my judgment, the threat of more India, and one of the things that I think is good about this administration's approach is threatening Pakistan that if you don't cooperate, we'll have more of an Indian role, which I don't think they want to, in effect, deal with this problem. I think Doug is right. They don't want India on their side, but they will get that more and more if they don't come to terms with this issue, because we have when I was ambassador, my instruction was to minimize the Indian role. And we did. We didn't want them to have a role in the security training and so on. But did that produce a more cooperative relationship? No. So I think that if Doug was running Pakistan, I think it would be perfect, because he would be driven by those interests and therefore would want good relations with its neighbor. But unfortunately, he's not. And the people who are running Pakistan see themselves, in my judgment, as the greatest strategists God has created. These military guys who are running Pakistan, and they are the successor of the Mughals. They defeated the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Now they will defeat the United States and use the same kind of asymmetrical approach, insurgency, terrorism, to undermine India and to become a much bigger power than a normal state would want to be.
So the short answer, and this really will be short, because we want to get to your questions.
Yeah.
The reason I think that they tolerate and in some form support the Afghan Taliban, and in particular the Quetta-based Afghan Taliban, is first of all, Quetta is in Baluchistan, and an outsized packed military presence in Baluchistan would be more problems than it's worth to Pakistan. So it's not in their interest to be there. And they don't want to ally the Afghan Taliban.
So you think they don't support their presence in Quetta? They would like them to leave Quetta?
No, they tolerate it. I mean, they tolerate it. I don't think it's open support. It is not the air-conditioned. There are no air-conditioned buses running in Quetta. But I think that has as much to do with the Baluch problem.
Did they move the Haqqani network?
Yeah, I'm not there. I'm not there yet. Okay. All right. So, in the fact that Quetta is in Baluchistan overlaps, and from Pakistan's perspective, with the Baluch problem. That's part of the problem. The second issue between the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban, all 99% Pashtun based, is they don't wish to ally those two groups. They don't want, and while they are nominally allied now, they don't tend to be. One is Afghan focused, the other is Pakistan focused. That is to the PAC military's advantage. What they don't want to do is anything which would cause those two groups to ally and create a bigger instability problem in Pakistan. So in both cases, the stability in Baluchistan and the stability across what you might call the Pashtun belt, which is Baluchistan up into the Fatah and so forth, I think does reflect this internal fixation on stability inside Pakistan. Now, that's not to. I don't think the buses were air conditioned, Zal. I think you added that.
That's what I.
Okay, but they did they ensure that the Haqqanis were not caught up in the North Waziristan sweep? Yes, of course they did. But that's a different. For me, that's a slightly different, although related issue.
So what you've all just seen is a replay of every NSC meeting that ever was on these countries, probably since, I would say, the Carter administration. If you look back to the I'm not joking. If you look back to the cables and the reporting that came out, even during the Soviet invasion and afterwards, these are the
Unfortunately, I've been dealing with this problem since then.
These are the same questions that policymakers have been struggling with. Yeah. So, Ambassador Khalilzad, you've actually, as ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq, you've helped to craft two constitutions.
Right.
You've negotiated and forged governing coalitions. And so being a policymaker is both about the substance, but also the tactics and the design of policy, right? And so if you were to elaborate a little bit more on the components of a political settlement and what role Pakistan, as you've described it with its interests and its behavior and tactics, what role, and this is a question for both of you, what role does Pakistan have in a political settlement in Afghanistan if it does have these interests, whatever your opinion is on those interests we've heard? How do you design it as a responsible policymaker, knowing that there are American lives at stake and it's been very costly for the American people?
I would think if I was a Pakistani leader, and I know that civilians and leaders of Pakistan, many of whom I know, and I've known since I've been going to Pakistan since the 80s, when we got engaged, would share this view. But not everyone in the military, and not the dominant, because there is two Pakistans in a sense. There is the military establishment, the corps commanders, ISI, the chief. And then there is the rest, so to speak, the civilian government. They would want in Afghanistan, they should want in Afghanistan that's non-hostile. In my view, that's a legitimate interest, and that Afghans should give them that. But what does that mean? That means that in Afghanistan that doesn't house problematic peoples who want to carry out an insurgency against Pakistan, whether it's the Pakistani Taliban, whether it's the ethnic insurgents. It doesn't want to have an Indian military presence that threatens Pakistan, that has economic cooperation, that it allows, Pakistan allows Afghans to trade across Pakistan and with India, which is the biggest market of the region. And the Afghans historically have had economic ties with India. And Pakistanis trade northward through Afghanistan to Central Asia. And there is all kinds of corridors that the Afghans have called during our time. Afghanistan was called as a land bridge between South Asia and Central Asia. Later on, the Silk Route, the New Silk Route, and now Asian Roundabout. We changed the names, although there isn't really that substantive progress. So that would, and there could be some additional details that could be worked out, in exchange for which Pakistan has to do the same thing, more or less, not to allow sanctuaries. Imagine if in Kabul was the headquarters of Pakistani Taliban. I mean, what would Pakistan react to that? Imagine Quetta was the opposite, and in Kandahar you had the Kandahar Shura having Baloch nationalists or having others. And in Afghanistan, you're right, I've worked with the Afghans and the Iraqis. I don't see why there couldn't be with a mutual accommodation with those Taliban who would want to join the government, who would be in power share. Doug knows quite well that even when I was in government and then after government, we've tried to reach out to the Taliban and to encourage them to participate. And in fact, the Afghans have said, well, they have got alliances in Afghanistan right now that the unity government is made of very different components. Why not have another component also added in a unity government that reflects, and they could, there is a process for changing a constitution that is inherent in the Afghan constitution if the Taliban had some concern and agreed to a process through which the constitution can be changed. I know that myself, from dealing with the Afghan leadership now over the past 16 years, and from President Karzai to President Ghani, that they are very interested in such a deal with the opposition. But the opposition perhaps believe that time is on their side, that the U.S. will give up, and they will win ultimately. And I think that the requirements for a peace settlement is that change in the calculation of Taliban and Pakistan, which supports it, that a settlement through negotiations is the better alternative than counting on the U.S. withdrawing, abandoning Afghanistan, and them coming back to power. And I know that Doug has tried very hard. We and I, when he was running this part of the world, was one of the passionate and most articulate and persistent supporter of this idea. We even talked about perhaps having the UN. I take the responsibility. I don't know whether you do, but of having a role in even in this and reaching out to people who could play a role internationally. But it wasn't because Ashraf Ghani is opposed to a reconciliation. He's not, and so therefore. Really, the burden is on the other side, and I think conditions on the ground has to change because they have deteriorated for the government in the last couple of years. Those conditions, in my view, will be determinative. And once there is, in my view, although details, the devil is always in details, and they can delay and derail, but I think conceptually, I can see a way that this could be negotiated if there was a decision made that that's the way that we ought to go. And I think Pakistan's decision that this is the way to go, meaning, not just saying something, but doing the opposite, but really meaning to say this is what we want, and working with us and with those in Afghanistan who want that. We certainly want that. I mean, even the Secretary of State repeatedly says that's our exit, is a settlement. So it's not that this more, the strategy that I support is against this outcome.
So, look, I really agree with Zal's vision of what Pakistan ought to want in Afghanistan. I don't dispute that at all. I also don't dispute the central, I think, that the essential role that some sort of reconciliation, talks, political settlement between the Kabul government and the insurgency, the Afghan Taliban, is absolutely core to this. I mean, without that, I've got a 13-year-old daughter. She needs to start learning Pashto or Dari, because we're going to send this generation, and we're going to send the next generation. As long as an American administration is willing to keep American troops there, they're going to be required. So this is endless. This is a classic definition of a stalemate, unless we get at the political roots of this. One of the political roots, and the one Zal mentioned, is absolutely on the mark, and that's the political stalemate between the government, the Taliban, or I'm sorry, the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government in Kabul. But that's only one of 3 political stalemates in my book. There's an internal Afghan government stalemate, and the national unity government is almost anything but unified. So there's that problem. And oh, by the way, this problem is going to revisit us shortly because we're about to enter back into Afghan political season. So the national unity government, which was fashioned with high-level diplomacy in 2014, is going to come up for renewal. And I just wonder how that's going to go, right? And then the third political stalemate that is impeding progress here is the regional stalemate. We've talked here only about, well, we mentioned briefly India, right? But this is very much fixated on Afghanistan and Pakistan. We shouldn't forget that if we look at the map, there's a major challenge to the west in Iran, and I just was in Moscow last week. There's a big interest to the north with Moscow and the Central Asian states as well. So this is a classic demand signal for more diplomacy. Now, on that first one, the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government, I believe Pakistan should play a role. It should not be benign neglect, much less toleration of safe haven and support, or even worse, active support. There should be active pressure on the Afghan Taliban living in Pakistan to come to the table. And there could be some ultimatums here that are issued by the Pakistani state. But Pakistan's got to have sufficient confidence in the other 2 stalemates as well, because a deal between the Pakistan-based Afghan Taliban and the government of Afghanistan will not be sufficient in itself to deliver the Afghanistan that you envision. It's going to require a regional perspective. Are we going to be willing to talk to Iran about this problem? Is this anywhere on the scope in U.S.-Russian relations these days? No. I mean, Pakistan's looking around and they see what's possible and what's not possible. And how much confidence does the Pakistani government have in the next round of the national unity government in Kabul? So it may well be that they have a broader perspective of what it's going to take to stabilize Afghanistan, and they may not be willing at this point to go very far out on the limb in terms of pressuring the Quetta-based Shura. Now, in the end, they're going to have to, if we're going to get to Zal's and my vision of Afghanistan. But it alone won't deliver it. So this is a multi-dimensional, complex political problem. And then I know you want to get to this, Shamila, but you got to wonder, how is this administration going to deal with the politics and diplomatic demand signals
Right.
when we see things like the office that you once worked in and that we all worked with, the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And when you look at the bureau, the regional bureau in which this specialty office is now folded in, it is undermanned, under-resourced, and has an acting assistant secretary working very hard, very diligent, but not an expert in this region. So, and by the way, you know, the next ambassador to Kabul is right now stuck in Ankara, okay, and fighting over visas or something. Okay, so, I mean, I just don't see the political diplomatic bandwidth to deal with these three simultaneous political stalemates that really lock us into the status quo. And I don't think any of this is a surprise to Pakistan either. So they're not looking at this narrowly. They're looking at this region.
Do you want to reply?
Well,
or?
I think now from initially started to disagree, we're going to agree violently, which is that...
this is the mark of a successful panel, by the way, right?
Which is that, although I believe that the conditions right now are not ready for effective diplomacy, because just because having offices full of people, when the conditions are not appropriate, doesn't mean you get somewhere. Otherwise, we would have gotten an Afghan settlement long time ago. We had a very empowered envoy. We had a large team of players with him, very distinguished people, including the dean. And we had, but we didn't get it to where we wanted to go because the conditions were not appropriate for a deal. So I give the administration a little time to work on the conditions. And the conditions, one of them is a change in the balance on the ground. It's not there yet. The strategy has just started. There are more forces, more authorities given to the commander to use the force as required, more enablers, more intel focus, because we reduced the intel under the previous administration as we reduced the force dramatically. We're targeting the Taliban too, which the previous administration said they are not our enemies. So we are trying to work on, I mean, I shouldn't say we, the administration is trying to work on the conditions. There is going to be time for diplomacy. But for everything, there is a time and there are conditions. And I believe that there should be a presidential envoy. I even support the idea that it should be in the White House, closer to the president. Because it's a war. You need to be able to direct the military. You need to be able to direct the intelligence. You need to be able to direct diplomacy. You need to integrate those. And you need to speak authoritatively when you speak. Although the envoy we were talking about spoke authoritatively, but I don't know how whether his authoritativeness was from the White House or not. Therefore, I agree with that there is we need an envoy who can deal with the political complexities that Doug mentioned, Afghan elections. Failed elections, whether for parliament, for presidency, isn't going to help the cause. Regional diplomacy is important. We faced dilemmas with regard to Iran, I agree. Iran played a very positive role in the Bonn agreement that when we initially got into this.
And so did Russia.
And so did Russia, so did India. So there will be a time for it, and we may face challenges and dilemmas. I think right now, while I agree, we need to work on the conditions and turning Pakistan if we can, that's what's required, because we will face different decisions if we can turn Pakistan. To turn Pakistan and to do what's necessary, and I have a great confidence that if Pakistan doesn't cooperate with the current diplomacy approach, there will be a phase for coercive steps. We will have to go through that before, in my judgment, we'll get to a clarity of whether we're succeeding in coercing Pakistan.
I want to open it up for questions.
Yeah, let me just very quickly, sorry. This
Very
always happens
quickly.
when you put Zal and me in this.
In Doug Lute minutes.
So first of all, I don't believe that changing the security stalemate on the ground, on the battlefield, will be sufficient to unlock the politics. Okay, and Pakistan. But
right, yeah.
look, if we think that adding 3,000 advisors and adding artillery and more close air support and all that sort of thing is somehow going to change the calculus on the battlefield sufficient for the Afghan Taliban to make a strategic choice like this. I mean, they've been at this for a while. And that a while included a period where we had 140,000 Western troops in Afghanistan.
Except we announced that we were withdrawing them within a year, and that we dissipated the benefits of the
Okay, but all right,
administration that you work with.
So let's pose
yeah.
pose another. So now we'll go to 14,000. So we'll be at 1/10 of this, but it'll be there as long as it takes.
Right.
Okay, so do we really think that's going to be? All right, so I would just argue as an old military guy, somewhat dated now, that I don't think 3,000 troops is going to change the military equation. I also don't believe, and this is more to your question, Shamila, right, that the U.S. today has sufficient leverage on Pakistan to cause it to change the strategic calculus that we've discussed here this evening.
Sure.
I'm not sure we ever had that kind of leverage, but I definitely don't think we have that kind of leverage now, given Russia's and China's role in support of the Pakistani state. So the end result of all this may be sustained stalemate in Afghanistan and Pakistan that's much closer to Russia and China.
So
I will just say one sentence only, that you may be right. I'm not saying, but I just am not sure. I just don't want to a priori, before we have even started to implement the strategy, to throw my hands up and say it's not going to work.
Well, it'd be very hard. It'd be hard to do that unless.
And therefore, I just say, we could be back here in a year and discuss now that if we have made the progress, what should we do now? If we haven't, what should we do then?
But
I would say that we have never been as serious with Pakistan as we are now. That we will deal with this problem. Either you deal with it, or we will deal with it, and we'll see what the roadmap is. There is a roadmap for on what to do if they don't cooperate. We'll see. We'll play that out, and I remain. My ability to predict, the record shows, is very limited. And I would say that the ability of our government to predict is even worse than mine. And we have predicted many times things will happen, will not happen, that have not been the case. So I remain agnostic, but supportive. That I think that if we have a chance to do better, this strategy is it. But we'll see whether the implementation is effective, because conceptually you could come up with ideas, and a success and failure sometimes depends how effective you are in terms of implementation. And we'll see what happens on the ground and in terms of diplomacy and all the issues that Doug and I agree on that will have to be addressed.
It's hard to judge a conditions-based approach if you don't know the conditions.
If you don't know the conditions.
Right. So I mean, we're all
Yeah.
shooting in the dark here a little bit, right? So
Yeah,
I mean,
Doug, you mentioned this, and then I'm going to close this conversation. We'll open it up for
You're
questions.
going to try to close this
I'm going to try to
conversation?
close it, but we don't have time to talk about this today. But there's a difference between American leadership and American influence and American leverage. Those are three separate things.
Sure.
And just because we increase our troop presence doesn't necessarily mean we increase our influence or our leverage, especially given the changing regional dynamics and these new bilateral relationships that the countries in the region are exploring. So that's a topic for another day.
Discussion, yes.
But now you know why we call this a debate on U.S. national security. It's an ongoing discussion. I'd like to open it up. Let's see, right there, the gentleman. Yes, you. And wait for the microphone, please. Introduce yourself and your affiliation, please.
This is Salman Ali Bhatani from the tribal area of Pakistan. I teach at School of Politics and International Relations, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. It was an enlightening talk, but Ambassador, trust me, Pakistan is a normal country, normal state. It's not an abnormal state. Talking from a standpoint where the equation is not complete, I think, because I'll just share two facts. One, 2 weeks back, correct me with the date, the person who did APS massacre, Army Public School Peshawar massacre, was hit by American drone in Afghan territory, right? And there is another fact that I every day go to my school and I teach my students, and in every class, I have 7 to 10 Afghan students. They're Afghan nationals. I teach them, and I'm really proud of that. But I just want to ask, my question is that considering the fact that there are problems with the Pakistani military, there are problems with the orientation, but the strategic calculus that you are referring to has different underpinnings. First, the tacticals are, I think, related to the cold start strategy on the other side of the border. Tacticals have nothing to do with Afghanistan. They were not for Afghanistan. There is no connection.
Sure.
And second is that don't you think so that there is this, the political setup in Afghanistan lacks that kind of influence which could somehow either convince Pakistan or be at an equal footings for better diplomacy, as in, because our leaders in our state tell us that we don't know whom to talk to. Talk to Ghani Saab or talk to Abdullah Saab. Plus, there is also this great fact that 70,000 people, civilians, have died in Pakistan as well. So I think nobody would say that Pakistan army have somehow used their influence in Taliban and killed their own people. Somebody has been doing that as well. And there have been civilian casualty in Afghanistan as well. So the equation is somewhere in both ways. It's not just limited to Pakistan. And for greater diplomacy, I think I would need your suggestions and your input. How this equation could be balanced in a way that jumping out of rhetoric a little bit, because obviously Pakistan would not, army would not leave its position. They have been not leaving their position for the last 14 years. And trust me, it's a very tricky history if you talk about 1980s and Haqqani, because from American consulate, from the T-bar of American consulate to the air-conditioned buses, the history is very tricky.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
and that's why I think for the people of both the countries, and really people need peace, enough is enough. I think a very balanced approach is required where political regimes on both sides need to be empowered. I need your comments.
so, well, thank you, first of all, for your question and your comment. I agree with you that the nuclear equation is for India rather than for Afghanistan. I didn't mean to imply anything different. And I support your idea of a balanced approach where the interests of both countries are served, because there is no other way to come to a settlement of the kind that Doug and I agree with. Where I differ with you is the question of Pakistan not knowing who to talk with. I think they know quite well who to talk with. They can talk with us. We are very influential still in Afghanistan with our military presence, diplomatic presence, economic presence. They can talk with the Afghan government. Now, sometimes the unity government, because of the constraints that they have, it's used as an excuse to say, who do we talk with? There are two leaders. When there was a single leader, all powerful, all authoritative, standing up to us when he wanted to, there was no progress either. And he went 70 times to Pakistan, and President Karzai, 70 times he went to Pakistan during his tenure. And there wasn't. I believe, and I may be biased in this regard, that the problem of reaching mutual accommodation is not on the Afghan side. They're the weaker party. They're a weaker party. They're the vulnerable party. They're in a difficult situation. Pakistan is a stronger state with a lot of influence and leverage gained over a very long period of time, going back to the days of the jihad. Since you're from the Northwest Frontier area, you would appreciate that. The problem is, in my judgment, after 30 years of dealing with Pakistan in various ways, is on Pakistan's side, and they need to come with a change in view. This change could be externally imposed, and we are saying whether there is enough external influence to bring that about. And I respect Doug, so he has an analysis that's going to be tough. or it could come from inside, or some combination perhaps. And that's what is required. I think the Afghans appreciate what Pakistan has done for them during the period of the fight against the Soviets. So many Afghans lived in Pakistan. Actually, there was a transformation of Afghan attitude towards Pakistan. They historically were hostile to Pakistan because of the Durand Line and the Pashtuns being divided that Doug talked about. But then they saw the Soviet struggle period and how kind the Pakistanis were to them. And there was a very different attitude. And now that has become back hostile because of the last 16 years. So, and you're right that Pakistan has paid a price for extremism and terror internally, and the killings of the officers' kids and so on that you mentioned, all is true. But unfortunately, Pakistan makes a distinction between bad terrorists and extremists, bad Taliban who target Pakistan, and good Taliban, good terrorists who target Afghanistan and India. Until this changes, that the terrorist is a terrorist, an extremist is an extremist, you can't have a good extremist that you support and a bad extremist that you oppose. Unfortunately, this is the dilemma, and they think the use of extremists facilitates success in foreign policy, whether it's against India and whether it's against Afghanistan. And unfortunately, they learned a lesson from the 1980s, and we are in part responsible because together we supported the Afghans against the Soviets very effectively, and they said, wow, this is a powerful instrument. I could use it for my own purposes now that even against the United States. So that's a long way of responding to your question, but I appreciate your sentiment about a balanced settlement, which I think the Afghans largely want.
So the point on nuclear weapons is right. I mean, doesn't have to do with a nuclear threat against Afghanistan, right? But what it does have to do with is the sort of priority listing of American interests.
Absolutely.
And my belief is that if it comes down between choosing some sort of political outcome in Afghanistan and America comparing that to increased risk of losing control of or the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, we will vote on the security of the nuclear weapons.
But the two have nothing to do with each other.
Well, they could if the stability of the Pakistani state is at risk. So and the 100 or 200 nuclear weapons.
If we dismantle Pakistan, you're saying that.
No, if it implodes, if it implodes, right?
Yeah.
So, so there's that issue. The other is a very quick quote from President Karzai, and you might have been in the same room. This is at dinner in the White House. I think under the Bush administration.
Bush,
but he said, look, here's the whole problem, he said, right? He said, Afghanistan is a nation without a state.
Right.
And Pakistan is a state, he was thinking about the army, right, without a nation. And it has at least 4 nations inside the Pakistani state. He said, if you understand that, if you just comprehend that, you're very much in this position of trying to untangle this.
Unfortunately, I don't share that view of President Karzai, but that's a separate issue. Don't get me started.
We'll take this question right here, please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Feroz Mahboubi. I'm from Afghanistan. I was a peace ambassador for Afghanistan and Pakistan's relation. I've worked with the U.S. Army for nearly 8 years as a journalist and also a deputy spokesperson for Kandahar governor. There are a lot of things that I should say I wanted to share, but unfortunately maybe I won't have a time for that. But still, I have 2 questions, and also I support a lot of points of Ambassador Khalilzad, that Pakistan is always, like, I've been there in Pakistan, in Islamabad, and also we invited their youths to Afghanistan to see everything from near. So we never blame each other for double gaming always. And in Afghanistan, they have seen everything by their own eyes. There was nothing. And in Pakistan, I've seen a lot of things. We met with their political leaders. And also the youths over there, they were thinking that there in Afghanistan, there are 45 consulates of India. And it was funny because we have only 34 provinces. And including that, yes, more than our provinces. Including that, I should say that there were so many things, but Pakistan had always concerned about India's involvement in Afghanistan. But there is one thing else, like a brother mentioned, that the guy who had, the attackers of Peshawar school he was killed in Afghanistan. That shows that we are against all terrorists. We are not saying that there is good Taliban and bad Taliban, which I have heard a lot from Pakistani establishment and their youths in all ways. Like, they are only against Pakistani Taliban, not Afghan Taliban. They are living in Quetta. I've seen them by my own eyes.
So what is your question is about
yes.
Pakistan's relationship with terrorist groups?
Yes, I should say that in Balochistan, I have seen the Taliban, which were getting their recruitments, and like they were encouraging youths, the young Afghans that were learning over there, who were students in madrasas and all that. They were recruiting those as a Taliban, and they were training there in Shin area of Balochistan, and then they were sending them to Afghanistan to fight. So still, I do have two questions now, that the terrorist activities and the nuclear power of nuclear weapons of Pakistan, isn't it a threat to US or the world? How to control that, or how do you see the solution for this, the future threat? And also, if US know that that Pakistan is supporting these terrorist groups, why didn't it stop them in the beginning or in the start? Why now? Thank you.
Okay. Doug, do you want to take that second question first?
Well, let me take.
I feel like we talked about the first part.
Yeah, the first one is, yeah, we should be concerned about the combination of extremists and the nuclear weapons which are expanding. So absolutely, I don't think we disagree there. Look, times change, right? I mean, there was a time when the U.S. priority in this region had nothing to do with Afghanistan and Pakistan. It had to do with Russia. It had to do with Soviet Union, right? So, I mean, you at least have to go back to those days, from 79 to 89, to begin to unravel this. Right. And clearly, that's a much different equation today.
Okay. Rizwan.
I'm Rizwan from Pakistan Embassy. And as you can see, or perhaps feel, I'm not abnormal, nor is certainly my country. And let me start, and I hope whatever I say will go to prove it. The topic that has been chosen today is Pakistan, a problem or an opportunity. Let me say that Pakistan is a country, neither a problem nor an opportunity, but like any other sovereign state, a country which is entitled, like any other sovereign state, to take its own decisions in accordance with its own national security requirements. And we have a history of cooperating with this country, where I stand and speak today, which perhaps has been mostly, we feel, forgotten for the large part in even analyzing the problem of Afghanistan, because we did not reach here where we are as partners, as countries dealing together or trying to deal together with the situation in Afghanistan in a few years or in a few days' time. There's a 4-decade-long history of almost 4 decades of how it started and where Pakistan is. Pakistan is a country that has suffered the most because of terrorism. The loss of lives has already been mentioned. I would not go into narrating point by point and responding point by point to what has been said. But what I would say is that it is a very difficult region of the world. There is a very complex interplay of history, geography, politics. So we have since day one as a country been a security challenged state. There was a congenital security threat that we faced from the east. And we have seen it not only transform into a larger threat, but also move westwards. And the latest battle that we have fought with our army, 200,000 no less, deployed in our own country, engaged in an operation in our own country, where we got rid of terrorists and we established writ of state only for the first time in the history of that entire region. So there are lessons to be drawn from the history of that region. We are the ones who have dealt with this problem very successfully in terms of rooting out the terrorist infrastructure in that part of the world, where even the British colonists and history before that, rulers before that, including the Mughals that have been referred to, did not intervene much or as much as they would have liked to. So it's a very complex situation in the world. It's a very complex region in the world. And the best thing to do in dealing with this problem would be not to coerce Pakistan, or for that matter, any other country in that region, or follow a coercive approach, but look at how politically we can solve it, how diplomatically we can evolve an approach where we can partner again and try and solve this issue. Because it has been said that you can talk to us or you can talk to Afghans. Well, we have been talking to both Afghans and the United States. In the last 2 years, for instance, we can count how many high-level visits from the Pakistani side have taken place to Afghanistan, and look at how many people have traveled from Afghanistan in high-level terms to Pakistan to talk to us. And similarly for United States, how many times our leaders in the last 2 years, ministerial levels, have reached out and talked to United States, and how many times United States has traveled to Pakistan to talk to us. We can look at the history of wars in that region and around the world, the recent wars in particular, and continue to go on and look at or find military solutions or coercive approaches, or like civilized people in modern world, we can afford a chance to diplomacy to solve issues.
Can I respond to this?
Yes,
Well, first of all, I appreciate the distinguished diplomat from Pakistan his point of view with regard to the fact that Pakistan is a sovereign state and entitled to make its own decisions. And that's obviously a fact, and we do respect and should respect Pakistan as a sovereign state. But I hope that in return, Pakistan accepts that Afghanistan and America are also sovereign states, and that they have to make decisions for themselves too. If Pakistan is as a sovereign state entitled to self-defense too, it also has responsibilities that come with sovereignty. And one responsibility is you shouldn't allow your territory to be used for attacking other countries. And since we are also victims of the groups that attack Afghanistan, they kill our people too. During my time as ambassador, I saw our people getting injured and killed. We have the right of self-defense, an expectation from a sovereign Pakistan, and that through diplomacy, and no one can say we have rushed through a confrontation with Pakistan. Actually, we have been quite patient. 16 years is a long time, and the Quetta Shura has existed, or the Haqqani network existed for a long time. So that's to that part. And I think diplomacy is obviously the right thing. That's what we want. I mean, the issue is no hostility to Pakistan. Sometimes people think that it's maybe some inherent hostility. That is not the case. We want a successful Pakistan. We want a prosperous Pakistan. We want a peaceful Pakistan. We want a secure Pakistan. But we would not like Pakistan to threaten its neighbors. Now, on the talking to each other, I have to say, unfortunately, I've had a lot of experience. Including one time I complained so much, that was before, I don't know whether Doug took over the account of Afghanistan in the White House when I was ambassador. I think you took it over when I went to Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. I was complaining so much in the NSC meetings and deputy committee meetings and principals committee meeting at the sanctuary that one time in an NSC meeting, President Bush asked me, he got tired of my complaints, I have to say, because, and he said, I'm going to do something for you, Zal. Yes, Mr. President said, I'm going to call President Musharraf and say, you're coming to see him, and you have to lay this out, that you constantly say they're doing this, they're doing that. And when I talk to President Musharraf, he says, no, we're not doing it. So off we go. So I say, maybe, Mr. President, I'm not the right person. He said, no, you're going. Yeah. So, I went, and I have to tell you that after a very courteous and very well, very positive reception, and I had taken a whole container of great Afghan pomegranate as a gift that President Karzai sent along with me to President Musharraf. And I dealt with the concerns on India. And I talk about it in my book in detail. I mean, this is an opportunity for advertising as to what he asked on India and what I offered to do for him on India to deal with his concerns. And he shook hands with me. That's, you know, this is so clear that the commitment that are making. And also he raised the issue of a dam that Afghans were planning to build on Kuna River that will cut off. And we came to an understanding on that issue as well. And then I said, Mr. President, anything else that bothers you about this new Afghanistan? Because, you know, your friends are now there. And you, President Bush, thinks so much of you. And so you are our friend too. We want you to get along. And then I said to him, can you do something for me, since I don't want to go empty-handed back to Kabul with all the commitment I've made to you? He said, what? I said, close the Quetta Shura, or give me some Taliban leaders. And you know what he said? He said, there are no Taliban in Pakistan. No Taliban. And I went back and forth with him. And I'm sure the minutes of that meeting, the cable because our ambassador, Nancy Powell, was with me, as well as some military people, our intel people. So, and I said, persisted that the media even goes to interview these people. And he said, these are all Indian propaganda. If you have something, give me their phone numbers, give me their house address, and then I'll act on it. So this is the problem. If he had said, look, you do this, or the Afghans do this, and I'll do that, that would have, I think, frankly, without exaggerating my role, I could have helped at that time. We were very close with the Afghan government. I personally was very close with the Afghan leadership and, of course, the United States. And we could have done something, but we couldn't get started because there was nothing. They're saying, no, you're making all this up. So how could you reach an understanding?
Doug, would you like to?
No, I think the good news is we're past that point.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so
A
you probably
long time
met
ago.
with Musharraf. I probably spent
Yeah.
100 hours with General Kiani, one of his successors, who had come from the ISI ranks, became the chief of the Army staff. And we had very open and candid conversations. And we were past the denial stage at that point. But it wasn't enough to get us where we need to be.
Yeah.
So I am sorry, we are actually out of time. Wait.
Yeah, there he is.
Please, sir,
Yeah.
please, sir. Well, I think they'll be available afterwards for conversation.
He's the Prime Minister. You cannot deny him.
Fine, fine.
We're honored.
If you're happy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm an American citizen. I'm very proud to be an American, and I'm a very openly gay American. Maybe your country has problem on that. I like to ask here. I like to please ask, I hope the gentleman won't interrupt and behave civilly at civil forums. Thank you. I like to ask here. When the Pakistan Army and ISI generals called the US soldiers in Afghanistan chocolate boys, this is their mindset. How can you guys have any talk with that mindset? The Pakistan, we are talking about opportunities from Pakistan after 9/11, after the 9/11 mastermind is found next door to the West Point, after 2,400, more than 2,400 US soldiers whose blood are on the hands of Pakistan Army and ISI inside Afghanistan, they were killed, martyred. Our people, the Baluch people, and the Afghan people are treated as ants and flies by the Pakistani generals. And we are talking about opportunity from Pakistan. Please don't do that.
Okay, that's it. No comment there.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
We should applaud Shamila.
Yeah.
She pulled this off.
I have one thing I do want to say. So today, this panel was about talking about the American perspective, which I hope was very obvious to everyone. I think that message was received. We will be hosting a series of other conversations that will look more into the Pakistani perspectives, Afghan perspectives, and Indian perspectives. This is an academic institution. It's not a think tank. We're here to educate people and hear different perspectives and resolve conflict, not produce it. So this is just the beginning. And I appreciate everyone speaking up on behalf of their own views and interests. That's what we want here. So that was very much welcome. And please come again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Nice job.
Good job.